WhatsApp takes India's government to court. The messaging app says new rules will force it to weaken privacy protections. So, is free speech under threat? And how much is the debate driven by politics? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. A court battle is pitting WhatsApp against the world's largest democracy. India is the biggest market for the messaging service. Nearly 400 million users rely on it to communicate with friends and family. But like many online platforms, it has struggled to control the spread of misinformation. India recently passed new rules forcing social media companies to identify the first person to send a message. WhatsApp argues this goes against privacy rights in the country's constitution. The company says it may have to stop encrypting messages, adding it's impossible to keep track of every message. Some believe the digital media rules have a political motive.
The issue is a bit more political. The Indian government doesn't like being defined, and no government does. It does want more control over the internet in India. It wants these platforms to censor content. And in a sense, India has a bit of China envy. It likes the control that China exercises over the internet, and it wants to be in a position to exercise similar control through platforms. So China has guidelines and rules that platforms have to adhere to. India wants something similar.
India's governing BJP has often had a tense relationship with big tech. Last month, it ordered Twitter and Facebook to take down posts which were critical of the government's COVID-19 response. Officials say those posts were wrong, but critics argue it's the government trying to control the narrative. That criticism was raised again a few days ago when police visited Twitter's offices in New Delhi. Officers reportedly wanted to know why a BJP spokesman had his tweet listed as manipulated media. The government banned TikTok and 200 mostly Chinese-made apps last year, citing security concerns. It happened shortly after skirmishes across the two countries' disputed border. All right, let's bring in our guests in New Delhi. Itika Sharma, Punit, co-editor of Quartz India, a digital news outlet. In Maastricht, in the Netherlands, Catalina Goanta, assistant professor in private law and co-manager of the Maastricht Law and Tech Lab at Maastricht University. And also in New Delhi, Karuna Nundy, advocate to the Supreme Court of India and an international lawyer. A warm welcome to you all. Itika, let me start with you today. I want to try to break some of this down for our audience. When we talk about traceability requirement and identification of first originator of information, what exactly do those terms mean? And what precisely is the Indian government requiring from messaging platforms like WhatsApp?
Hi. So the guidelines say a lot of things, but the most contentious is traceability. Traceability basically means that it's a clause that will require social media platforms to locate the first originator of an information. So at any time, if there is, for instance, a WhatsApp message that is found to be breaking any laws, the investigating authorities or the government can ask WhatsApp to trace who the first sender of this message or a meme or a photograph was. Now, WhatsApp says that this is unconstitutional and against people's fundamental right to privacy. In fact, the messaging app is calling this a new form of mass surveillance because in order to trace even one message, WhatsApp will basically have to trace every message because they don't know which is the one message that the government or the investigator will want them to trace. This would basically be, effectively it will be abuse to the users of WhatsApp. Also, it has a lot of flaws. For instance, if you simply download an image on your phone and you share it with someone, when this message is traced, it will show as if you are the person who created this image or wrote this article, or you're the person where this information originated from. So that is the main clause of contention. There are, of course, other clauses, including appointment of a grievance officer who should be local in India, etc.
Catalina, if WhatsApp were to eventually have to comply? And we know they're fighting this in court right now, but if they were to add traceability and allow it, what kind of precedent would that set for digital rights? I mean, other countries would surely start demanding this as well, right?
So these are some very interesting points, and indeed we are now at a crossroads. What we see is that, and I can really tell the perspective of the European policy on this matter. We see that there is a trend to focus on digital monitoring. I think Itika was mentioning basically mass surveillance in the next 10 years. I think that this is going to be a very important policy point on every agenda around the world. What we have in Europe, for instance, is the Digital Services Act, where on the one hand, questions about how do you deal with platform liability and how do you make sure that content that is illegal gets tackled in a more efficient way. These are also things that are right now falling under the Digital Services Act. However, the type of interference that it poses is definitely lower in comparison to the Indian legislation that was just discussed. So on the one hand, I agree that it is a very, really questionable development and also controversial development. But I do believe that there are also some alternative regulatory regimes that we can talk about.
Karuna, how unusual a step is it that WhatsApp is taking India's government to court? How significant is that? And do we have any idea how this might play out at this stage?
So WhatsApp's taken the Indian government to court before, and I mean, that's all right. Government, it's not personal. It's against a policy, right? I think it's true to say that if digital rights are under threat anywhere, then they're under threat everywhere. Because these platforms are transnational. And when we look at the limitations that they bring, whether it's on failing to crack down on hate speech, whether it's failing to resist governments when there's an over-incursion on free speech, when there's an incursion, an unjustified incursion on free speech, or indeed whether it's a failure to abide by local laws of particular countries that are in accordance with international human rights and digital rights. I think that these are squarely transnational and international law issues. I think we have to be really clear, though, that there are a huge number of problems with these IT rules of 2021. And the requirement of WhatsApp to look at, to sort of break the end-to-end encryption, essentially. And what they're being asked to do is to create a completely different tech model for India, which is a problem, right? But the problems with the rules are much, much greater. Because what the rules do is that they effectively create a governmental oversight mechanism for all digital content, whether it's from news media or OTT streaming platforms. And the oversight mechanism is able to ban content, to censor content, and it's not even in a legislation, it's not even in a law that has passed the scrutiny of Parliament, it's in these purported rules. Now, the rules are meant to be issued under the Information Technology Act, but the Information Technology Act doesn't actually allow them to issue these rules that are so broad that they're even beyond the Act, and they're also, according to me, beyond the Constitution. So when you have criminal liability for, suddenly being potential criminal liability, suddenly being imposed on digital news media that hasn't come under the control of the government in the past in this way and shouldn't, in my view, and also OTT platforms, then you have a much bigger problem. And the disclosure, the breaking of end-to-end encryption by WhatsApp is already a big problem.
Catalina, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Karuna was saying there, so I want to see if you wanted to jump in. But also I wanted to ask you, because Karuna was talking about tech companies having to comply with various international laws. How difficult is it for tech companies and social media and messaging platforms to strike that balance in complying with the laws of different governments, different countries around the world, but also trying to ensure freedom of expression and privacy for users?
I would say that it's quite a mess. If you're a platform that operates globally, indeed, as you pointed out, there will be all of these domestic rules at national level, at federal level that platforms need to deal with. And as we were hearing earlier, so if WhatsApp is going to have to really exercise a specific business model in India, but then a completely different business model in Europe, and then again a different business model in the United States, that's just that's not also good for users, because when we're speaking about WhatsApp, at least recently, some of the let's say the most important features that it has retained that are considered to be positive will be features dealing with the encryption that it uses. So here we see in this example that we're lacking international rules that are going to be applicable to services that are similar and that apply similarly around the world. In comparison to the Indian regulation that we are talking about right now, the Digital Services Act proposes a very different approach. So there isn't a general monitoring obligation for social media platforms, for instance, to do when it comes to content that they host, but there is because the Digital Services Act basically takes on an earlier approach from the e-commerce directive that we have in the European Union that also said we're going to give platforms a regulatory subsidy. So we're not going to put this very high burden on platforms to make sure that they will know and they have an idea about everything that is happening there. So in Europe, this is going to be the continued regime. So we see already that there are these differences, and we would definitely be better off having more international harmonization on this matter.
Itika, I want to talk for a moment about the fact that WhatsApp isn't just popular among, citizens in India. It's also popular among politicians and political parties. The 2019 general election was referred to by many as the WhatsApp election in India. So I want to ask you, how much was WhatsApp used as a vehicle to spread disinformation and manipulative political messages during that election cycle? Also, how much were political parties and politicians able to utilize the popularity and the power of WhatsApp to their advantage?
So WhatsApp is one tech platform that has, in number terms, it has the most number of users. On last count, WhatsApp had close to 400 million users in India. In comparison, Facebook has around 300 million, Twitter around 700 million, 1700 million, I'm sorry. It is also a platform that is used across age groups, from the elderly to the youth. WhatsApp is used across the board. So, of course, any messaging on WhatsApp has a very widespread and wide reach. So, whether it is for elections or, in fact, I would like to add even for businesses these days, a lot of small businesses, or just misinformation, whether it is political or apolitical of nature. There's a term we use in India called WhatsApp University, because there is so much information that is being consumed by Indians via WhatsApp. A lot of people believe every message they get on WhatsApp. So during the elections, yes, there were a lot of, every time there are elections, whether it is state level or whether it is on the national level, WhatsApp is used as a very effective tool. WhatsApp groups or just mass messaging through WhatsApp. I remember correctly, I think it was around the last national elections, when WhatsApp had to take a lot of steps to ensure curtailing the spread of fake news in India, including measures like, stopping the number of times you can forward a particular message, which is in use till date. So yes, WhatsApp has big reach, and it is not just a common person using it. It is a great tool in the hands of political parties, the government, and even businesses.
Karuna, there's long been a problem with the spread of misinformation and fake news over messaging platforms like WhatsApp in India. We know this. Where is the line between what could be considered regulation and what is overreach and censorship and going after critics and dissidents and rivals?
I think that's a really good question. And with regard to fake news, globally, we don't have the answers yet, right? Because my fake news is your opinion. Of course, it's true that there are, on the margin, obvious situations that can be labeled fake news. Now, let us look at these very rules as they have been applied to a different intermediary, to a different platform, to Twitter. Now, Twitter would be required by these very rules, and Twitter has been doing this internationally, including most notably with Donald Trump's tweets, labeling them as being, not accurate, right? Now, this is something that was done by Twitter on the tweet of a BJP spokesperson. And very shortly after, we saw raids on the Twitter offices and what is widely perceived to be intimidation tactics. So there's, let us be clear, something of a trust deficit with regard to this government's actions when it comes to free speech. Now, Twitter has, not to mince words, been a bit of a disaster when it comes to regulating hate speech. But they've actually been pretty good when it comes to resisting, government's national attempts to limit free speech, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in other countries. In Pakistan, in fact, a lot of these platforms got together and they said that, look, we're not going to function in this country unless you get rid of the draconian rules and regulations that you're seeking to impose on us. India is a different situation because the user base in India is huge and it's too good to pass up on. Plus, our government is willing to use the criminal law and, in ways that don't have, that a lot of people feel is not equally applied to their friends and their foes, right? So we have a problem here. We have the nature of fake news in itself is something that's a bit of a tricky issue. But when you have a governmental, somebody who's related to the ruling political party, who's spokesperson of the ruling political party, gets labeled as spreading fake news in a particular instance, and various fact-checking, very credible fact-checking websites and others say that actually what they're saying, it is fake. Then, the standards that are meant to be applied to others are not only not applied to them, but the criminal law is brought into play. Then you've got a trust deficit. So maybe in a situation where these very fine determinations and these very finely tailored regulations could be useful. I mean, not these finely tailored regulations, because they're not. They're kind of like blunderbusses, right? And they use words like decency, which aren't defined anywhere. And your decency is completely different from my decency. So these IT rules have a huge chilling effect across the board. Plus, there's the concern that they're unevenly applied. But let me also make the point that...
Karuna, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let me get back to you actually about that point you were making about the chilling effect in just a couple of minutes. I did want to ask you about that. Itika, let me go to you right now. I mean, a lot of critics of Prime Minister Modi are saying that this is really driven by politics. What do you say? Is there a political motive behind all this?
Well, it is. In my understanding, it is a mix of few things. People who are saying that it is politically motivated, they are correct. The reasons seem correct and accurate. The way the government has been using social media platforms over the last 7 years just builds the case for people who say that it is politically motivated. For instance, just earlier this year, when the government was facing flack for the mismanagement of the second wave of COVID-19, we know that they pushed Twitter to take off certain posts and Facebook. So this new IT laws will be another weapon in their hand in that sense to clamp down on voices that they don't like or that are against them. At the same time, I believe that another reason for rules, like Karuna also said, that a lot of these rules are sort of, slightly outlandish, I would say. And that, I believe, is also because the policy lacks nuance in many ways. And this has been a problem with a lot of technology related policies that the Indian government has introduced over the last many years, including things like e-commerce policies, etc. So I feel it's a combination of both, but definitely there is politics involved. No one can deny that.
Catalina, let me ask you a technical question because, WhatsApp and other platforms have said that, this essentially is an impossible task. So I want to ask you, how difficult would it actually be for WhatsApp or a messaging platform like Signal to comply with these regulations? I mean, what would it require for them to trace these chats? Do they actually have, the kind of infrastructure to do this right now? And how would they have to change the architecture of these platforms to try to come into compliance?
So that's a very good point. And I think that when we're speaking about messaging platforms, which, as we heard before, so in certain different groups, they might be used in a very different way. So, for instance, WhatsApp being used as actually disseminating information as opposed to simply having conversations, because, as I said, they are messaging platforms. This is going to be rather different than, for instance, social media platforms that have been also voluntarily taking on obligations, for instance, to remove content that can be very, very harmful, such as child pornography. So I think for WhatsApp and for Signal, given their nature, this is even going to be more difficult because, for instance, to my knowledge, I would be very curious to hear also from my fellow co-panelists if this is the case in India, but to my knowledge, WhatsApp does not have content moderators. I know from what I know from the functionalities and the affordances of WhatsApp, I believe you can report different types of accounts, but and I believe that you can also report content, but it might be a very different infrastructure than what we see with social media companies. And it is quite troubling that at the end of the day, a lot of the content moderation decisions have been left to the devices of social media platforms. And I think the example of politicians having opinions and sharing information, whether we qualify that as misinformation, disinformation, or simply opinions on social media, is a very good example because we're not asking the question. So we are looking very much at what Twitter has done with political speech. We're really asking the question of whether it's for Twitter to determine whether a politician should or should not express opinions on that platform. But at the same time, let's look around at the regulatory frameworks. Do we have political speech covered that is really fixed for social media? So do we have a law that says this is what a politician has in terms of protections or in terms of obligations with respect to their engagement with social media? I know that in the United States there has been at least one case taken against actually Donald Trump when he used to be the president and when he used to block individuals using his Twitter account that was then the official Twitter account. So you see there's simply a regulatory gap because we need to have some rules of engagement with respect to what politicians can and cannot do on social media.
Karuna, we only have about a minute 30 left. Let me just ask you, were making the point before about the chilling effect that's going on in India because of this. How much does this all have the potential to erode freedoms and also to weaken democracy and the spirit of democracy in India?
I think it's more than the spirit of democracy. I think it's very specifically what people are able to say freely. Now, whether it's your conversation about, with your partner or with anyone else or with your accountant or with your doctor, mass surveillance is something that would inhibit what you can even say to them. So in terms of mass surveillance coming into your most intimate messaging, and let us be clear, it's already happening to a significant degree with my government, So let's be clear that it's already happening. Certain and other mechanisms, it's already happening on the internet. But the attempt to expand this, I think, is a big problem. Since I spoke earlier about the transnational nature of these companies, and while the negative effects here will have an impact worldwide, let's also be clear that moves like the GDPR in Europe have also had positive effects, right? So in fact, there are ripple effects of all these moves globally. But I think that this is also an opportunity to strengthen adherence to international law as a global people.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Itika Sharma Punit, Catalina Goanta, and Karuna Nundy. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.